listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and then suddenly everyone left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with people working in the grief field. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana DeCristofaro, and produced by the Dougy Center for Grieving Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. This show is all about people having the opportunity to tell their story. These stories are born out of their grief, but they encompass so much more about who people are, what they value, and how grief has shaped who they are today. When someone is facing a death or grieving the death of someone, there can be an urgent and strong need to voice how these events affect everything. Some people are lucky enough to find friends and family, or maybe even strangers, who are able to listen, and listen without judgment or unsolicited advice. More often, though, people worry that talking honestly about their experiences with grief are going to either drive others away or open them up to a barrage of unwanted advice and negative judgment. These fears are part of why Grief Out Loud exists, to create a community of those who want to hear the stories and a platform for those who want to tell them. You know who was really the pioneer in giving people space to tell their stories? StoryCorps. Maybe you've heard of them? StoryCorps is a nonprofit that works to preserve and share the stories of people from all backgrounds. Here at Grief Out Loud, we're really excited about one of StoryCorps' new projects called Road to Resilience, Memories That Move Us Forward. In this project, they are partnering with children's bereavement programs across the U.S. to amplify the voices and stories of grieving children, teens, and young adults. Grief Out Loud's home, the Dougy Center, has the honor of being one of those programs, and we've recently kicked off this partnership by training 13 of our staff and volunteers to be StoryCorps facilitators. Joining me today is Modupeola Oyebolu, who is a national facilitator with StoryCorps and part of the Road to Resilience team. In her role at StoryCorps, Modupeola holds space for people to share the stories of their lives that are most important to them. Dupe, thank you so much for joining me today on Grief Out Loud.
Yay, thanks for having me.
So often in this work of holding space for grieving children and families, we bring our own stories of loss into the room with us. Since you were born and raised in Nigeria, you have a window into what it's like to grieve in your home country, but also here in the U.S. How have you experienced grief in your life, and what's it been like to grieve holding these two cultures?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So growing up, I never knew anyone personally. Oh, I shouldn't say never, but when I was growing up, when I was younger, I didn't know anyone who died personally. I think one of my grandma's sisters died, and I went to that funeral when I was 7. So I had gone to funerals and I understood that death was a part of life and living, but it didn't really touch me until I was 19. That year that I turned 19, my grandma got sick and died pretty quickly in my eyes. That same year, she turned 85. I was starting to recognize my grandma as a person. For me, as I was growing up when I was younger, I experienced people like my grandparents and like my aunts and uncles. I didn't quite experience them as regular people. And I feel like at the time that my grandma died, I was going through that turn of, oh, wait, she's a person.
Almost like you start to see someone adult to adult, like, oh, you're a person I could interact with, not just someone who is here for me.
Or not just someone who is here to in my head, some of how I held adults like that was, oh no, I can't be a person around you. You're here to restrict and limit my existence in some ways. Her birthday was in May and she died in August. But it wasn't around May that I started to recognize that, oh, wait, my grandmother is a person who's interesting, who I want to get to know. And she was only sort of ill, she had malaria, which is having the flu. She came to our house for a while and she seemed to be getting better. So I was getting to know her and it was this really wonderful, magical time. And then the day before she got really ill, she also seemed fine. I think I remember thinking, oh my gosh, my grandma has a sense of humor. Like, we joked about something together. Like, I had one of those clicking, like, she's a person moments. And then she had what turned out to be like a slow building stroke. By the end of that day, she was no longer like conscious, and she wasn't conscious for like the next week, and she died soon after. Anyway, all of that is like a really long story to say that my grandma died when I was 19. And I remember being like really shocked that she died, even though she was 85 years old. I remember telling my mom that, yeah, like when grandma died, Hope died. What I was really trying to say, I think, was, oh, I like had shed that childish naivete of everything will pan out exactly how I hope it will.
Like that idea that everything is going to be okay and turn out the way you imagined it might.
Right, exactly. That was like my immediate lesson from my grandma's death. I think in Nigeria, like sort of like a sense of the spiritual and our like connection to like the spiritual is more foregrounded than it is, or than I find it to be in the circles in which I move in the US. And so like one of sort of my initial reactions to my grandmother's death was, oh, after like this sense of like, oh no, Hope has died, my next sense was, oh, but I will see her another time in future because like I will die also, and then I will be with her. Carrying that sense of we are only separated for a time was very comforting for me.
So this belief that there will be a chance to connect again and to see one another again.
Right, exactly.
Has that sense carried with you into your time in the U.S. and the additional grief that you've experienced since coming to the U.S.?
I think in some ways it has. As I was thinking about this, I feel like that sense of my grandma, of like, I will see her someday. I still carry it, but it's not as foregrounded. When I think of her and I think of what I lost in her, it's not the first comforting thought I get. And I think this has something to do with moving, but the first thought I get now when I think of her is more a sense of, what am I doing now to connect with her? And it's connected to my moving. In a way, it's like, this is like a meta cross-cultural thing. Because after I moved, I developed like a more keen sense of what my grandma represented to me culturally that I didn't realize at the time, like when I was younger and hiding from her because she was an adult who was like limiting my freedom. After I moved, like it became clearer to me that she was in a way like a bearer of my culture, right? Like she was the connection to my ancestors in so many ways. I don't know, she just held so much for me in terms of understanding and making sense of myself as a young Nigerian Yoruba person, like moving through the world. I think after moving to the US, those questions became bigger questions in my life. And when I think of her, my new, like, I guess you could say grief response is to think, oh, grandma died. How can I find her again now by like learning about my culture, like talking to her sisters? In a way, it's like connecting to her humanity, even though she's not here, but like connecting to the pieces of the cultural elements of her time and of her life. That's one thing that moving between cultures has done to my like grief and my grief expression. I've become like very curious about my family history, and I'm like interviewing everyone about what do you know, and I'm doing all this research on Yoruba culture and like the time in which my grandmother existed, her own father's time and his own mother's time, you know, and I'm trying to like draw all these links between them and me. And it's my new way of making sense of that loss.
Almost as if as when you were there, home in Nigeria, so connected to everyone and to the culture, and now that you are living far away from that, longing and craving to know yourself in connection to your family.
Right, exactly.
And you talked about your grandmother as sort of the historian, and I'm imagining that she is someone who was the storyteller in your family of how things were for her growing up. How do you see the power of storytelling unfold in your work at StoryCorps, of listening to people, being able to tell their stories?
I mean, StoryCorps' name is StoryCorps. So like you hear the word story right there. And I like to like say that, and I like to point to that because it's sort of like stories are like the meat, like the bread and butter of what StoryCorps does. We're holding space all the time for people to tell stories about their lives. There's a fact of the content of a story. When people tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end, sometimes it's just like documenting forgotten histories, right? Like that's what stories sometimes are, like when I think of them content-wise. But another way I like to think about stories and like the sort of relational quality of stories, by that I mean there's this question of when I'm telling you a story about myself, like what am I doing? Like what is the meaning being transmitted between us? Let me try to give an example. I always think of, so I moved to the US, and so like home for Christmas for me is like going to my aunt's house in Florida. My aunt has 3 kids who like all live apart. And so at Christmas, everyone comes together. And always, without fail, someone brings up a story of something that happened when they were 7 years old. And everyone in the room knows that story already. And my sense is that sort of what is happening when we are telling and retelling these stories is that we're reconnecting with each other, you know? Like we're like reminding ourselves of like who we were and how we were with each other in the past. And then you like feel a sense of the time that has passed.
It almost sounds like this idea of, even though there's not new content being shared, the familiarity of the story gives us a roadmap back to one another to re-engage with one another.
Yes, that's such a beautiful way to say it. Exactly. Yeah, like that. Like that's one of the things I think about when I think of like stories as like this like thing for like relationships. Well, I mean, there's even like sort of the more basic thing of, depending on who I'm talking to, like the stories that I choose to tell about myself, like say something about the nature of the relationship I have like with the person I'm talking to. So if I was talking to a stranger who I just met on the street, the story that I tell them about myself would be different than the story I would tell my like oldest friend Shade, like who I've known since I was 3, right? And so like so much about the telling of stories is like, in a way, it's not like the content, but it's what it's doing in our relationships. And it's like what I find myself most drawn to actually about storytelling. I mean, in the StoryCorps recording booth, we always say that so much of what happens in the booth is dependent on the relationship between the 2 participants in the space, or like the 3 participants, or however many participants are in the space. And I find myself paying attention to that the most when people are in the recording space.
It makes me think with this new project, The Road to Resilience, and enabling families to come together and tell stories after someone in their life has died. That's so often in families, when someone dies, they have to re-know each other. Because say you have, you know, parent and kiddo, and one of the parents died. Kiddo and one parent had a relationship. Kiddo and another parent had a relationship. Parents had a relationship. Mm-hmm. That person is no longer here. They have to renegotiate. What does it mean for us to have this relationship of just the 2 of us? And how do we maintain a relationship with the person who died? What have you seen so far? What have you experienced in sitting in stories with families who are part of the Road to Resilience project?
First of all, I just want to say that was a very like beautiful way of like describing. I'm like, my head is still stuck in your comment. I can't think of my answer to your question yet. Yeah, that was just like a really beautiful way of thinking about, the ways in which we're transformed by grief. And this is somewhat like connected to your question of like, what have I seen? And I think, a lot of what I've seen, honestly, I don't know. It's just like people are resilient. I mean, the program is called Road to Resilience, so that feels like a little bit of a cop-out. But also, maybe it's just a really good program title. I'm thinking of like a conversation that I shadowed recently, and was a mom and her daughter, and like they were just like talking about their experiences following their dad/husband's death. And I mean, they were really emotional, but they were also like I could feel the strength of their spirits just like from sitting in the room with them. that maybe is like my main takeaway. People are resilient, and like maybe that is the true place of like everything will be fine, as opposed to like how I thought about it when I was younger of like everything will be fine, i.e. everything will work out how I expect it to work out. Maybe the true place of everything is fine is people are resilient, people like pull through, people like find a new place to stand. I think I like hadn't also not quite registered how transformational an experience grief is. So that's another thing that I find myself coming back to over and over. How people come like new iterations of themselves after like someone important in their life dies.
It speaks to how powerful I think this project will be for grieving families, in that, you know, you come together and you get to tell your story. And as you mentioned, grief is so transformational. And so people's core stories of themselves oftentimes get blasted when someone in their life dies, like who they thought they were, where they thought they were moving in their life, the things that they valued, the things that were important to them. Oftentimes that gets just like smashed apart. And so to have this opportunity to come together with someone in their family that they care about and tell their story now, and to have an opportunity to, in a way, like make it official, you know, like here is the story of who I am now in this moment going through this heartbreak of grief. It just seems like a really powerful opportunity.
Yeah, people are just reflecting more on sort of more questions, more core questions about who they are, or like who their relationships are with the people who sort of with their loved ones who are in the recording booth with them. You see this articulation of that thing that you described of like the reorganization of their relationships. People are like articulating it in this space. I don't know, it just like raises more, as you said, core questions. Yes, absolutely.
So given your role at StoryCorps, you're so often the person who is holding space for the conversation, holding space for the recording of the story. If you were to sit down and be part of a StoryCorps conversation, who would you most want to record one with?
I mean, in some ways, my grandma. Okay, can I do two people?
Yes, you can do two people.
Okay, because I think like these two people respond to like different parts of myself. I think first my grandma for sure. If I could like bring her back to life, I would like force her into a StoryCorps booth. Hopefully I wouldn't have to force her. Hopefully she would voluntarily participate. I would ask her into a StoryCorps booth just because of like what I described earlier of how her death raised all of these questions about like who am I and how do I fit into the world? Who am I culturally? Like who are my people? Because I'm still like grappling with that so much, still wanting to understand that so much. And then the other person who I would really like to do a StoryCorps interview with is a really good teacher who I had, Dr. Amanda Taylor. She was one of my professors in my master's program at American University. And she's just like, I don't even know where to begin. She's just like an incredible person. In some ways, like it's that StoryCorps thing, right? Of like you want to like understand like how did you become yourself and like understand your vision, understand her vision for the world a little more. So those would be my two people, my grandma and the best teacher I ever had. That's it.
Or as you're talking, it sounds like the people you'd most want to talk to in this format are people who could teach you something about who you are, where you come from, and where you might be going in your life by understanding them.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it's like you're reflecting so much on your life experiences, right? So I think of it as like a way of like making sense of oneself, that like in the process of talking about yourself and reflecting on your life experiences, you're making sense of yourself and, like you said, who you are and where you're headed. When I think about storytelling and StoryCorps space and like who I would want to hold it with, and also like when I observe road to resilience, like those are a lot of the things that I come back to, like all these questions of the self.
Well, Dougy, I'm so grateful that you took the time to sit with me in this conversation today.
Yay, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
And listeners out there, please stay tuned because as the Dougy Center moves forward in this project with StoryCorps, We will hopefully be able to incorporate some of the clips from the recordings that our families are doing into the podcast. And who knows, there may even be a full-length feature podcast episode with some of those families as well. If you want to hear any of our past episodes, you can find them wherever you get your podcasts or on our website, dougy.org. Thanks for listening. Hope you'll join us again next time.